Is our sound up?
Should be.
It sounded a little dim.
Oh, actually, I did turn it down.
Thank you. The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata and make it real in our lives is what is really called for in our Zen practice. We have everything we need. We are already there. We just are covered over with kind of a coating of conditioning, of assumptions, of ideas, and most of all, the self-image that comes as a result of that conditioning. And so our Zen practice is about uncovering that true self, and we can. Interestingly, my Dharma brother, or Dharma nephew, I guess at this point, Rafe Martin has just written a new book. He's an author as well as a Zen teacher, a Dharma successor of Danon Henry, with whom I and Sunyana Roshi were ordained. That means we were ordained as Zen priests in the same ceremony together. We were established as Zen teachers separately, but we got our Buddhist robes in the same ceremony. It was kind of special for all of us, I think. At any rate, he wrote a book in which he took the Buddha's life experience and compared it to our own life experiences. And guess what? We share some of the same concerns, a lot of the same concerns, actually. And it brought the Buddha back down to earth. So many times in our Zen practice, we assume that the Buddha is some kind of exalted being who had this special gift whereby he could realize his true nature. But that's not the case. He was an ordinary human being. Sure, he came from a high-class family, but in some ways that made it harder for him to do that, because he was so protected. The story goes that when he was born, first of all, his mother died within days or hours. I think it was hours after he was born. Not uncommon situation for women, even in modern times. And it's known, at least when I've talked to students who have been adopted, they have a strong sense of having lost something precious when they were taken away from their birth mothers, even as tiny infants. There is a strong connection that is developed over, well, it's actually developed way before a conception, actually, but it develops further when the baby is in the womb of the mother and connects profoundly with the mother. The rhythms of development, the rhythms of the baby's own movements accord with the mother's heartbeat. And to calm a baby down, you hold it against your chest so that it can hear your heartbeat. It is strongly inculcated in infants. And so, although it's never been really mentioned, other than the fact that his mother did die quite soon after his birth, and his aunt, his mother's sister, stepped in to take over and become his stepmother, still, there must have been some sense of loss at that point in time. Rafe brings a lot of other things into focus with regard to the Buddha-to-be's life in comparison to our own. We share a lot of things, including this concern with sickness, old age, and death. And it doesn't usually hit people too young unless we've had somebody close to us die, particularly someone our own age, but it eventually does. Roshi Kapleau used to say that, I think it was Jung that said that there is not a certain single person over the age of 50 who is not concerned about death. And so it was not such an issue for him initially, but when he got to be at the age where things change in people's lives, whether you believe in astrology or not, it doesn't matter. But right around the age of 28, 29, 30, 31, right about that point in time, for many, many, many people, things change. Our life changes in sometimes major ways, including my own. It's when I came to Zen practice as a result of everything falling apart in my life right at that point in time. And so at that age, 28, he got curious about what was outside of the compound in which he lived, which was an extensive compound, given the wealth of his family. And he hadn't, for whatever reason, been curious enough earlier on to take the chance to sneak out. His father, who was so concerned that he would become his successor, had him highly protected. And so it's kind of hard to believe that, particularly in that part of the world at that era, or any part of the world in that era, that he wouldn't have encountered old age, sickness, and death. But somehow it didn't happen, at least not overtly so, until one day when he decided to go outside the compound and discovered first somebody who was old, bent over, hair falling out, teeth maybe not there at all. And he was shocked because he'd never seen, supposedly, an old person. And actually, in that era, people didn't live that long. It was not all that long ago in the United States that the average age of death was not much past 40. And it was not so different back then either. This is why when you read about Chinese monks leaving home at age 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, or in the case of New Mexico even, in the very, very early years before it became a state, there was a German man who came all the way from Germany to search for his son, who at 12 had left to explore the New World. This was pretty common in that era. And of course, I'm sure it was common in the days of the Buddha. He was married at 16, so by the time he was 28, he already had a young son. And this abiding curiosity began to grip him. It's a time, as I said, of very common in people to find a real change in direction. And so he thought, wow, what else can I see? And the next time he went out, that next night, he found someone who was ill. And I remember when I was in Hong Kong the first time, and a guest of a friend of my Chinese godfather who lived in Hong Kong, and he loaned us a car and a driver and sent us around the city to see things. And we went around a corner and there was an elderly woman just squatting in the middle of the street throwing up. When you live in Asia, Southeast Asia, you see these sites quite commonly because they're not hidden. And I'm sure it was the same in the era of the Buddha. But for whatever reason, he'd never seen somebody somehow. The people that were living and working in his compound were quite healthy and didn't die, at least not by the time he was 28. And so that shocked him even further. And then, of course, the third night he saw a corpse, which also is a very common sight in that part of the world. In 1996, early 1996, February 1996, when I was still living in Japan, I went to a conference of Western ordained Buddhist women in India, Bodh Gaya specifically, and death was everywhere. On the way out to the train at the end of this very long conference, which was almost a month long, we went past a corpse lying on the side of the street. And there were other indications of death quite close, well before that, including the fact that my father had just died as well, or was dying. Once we got to Delhi, we got the facts from my brother that he actually had died. So these were quite common sights in that era, except in the realm of the Buddha's household. And then the next night, he saw a spiritual seeker and realized that there was something beyond sickness, old age, and death. And each one of us is sitting here because we also have a sense that that is so. So if you have a chance to get Ray's book, I don't recall what it's called, but it's brand new. I think it's to come out early this spring. It's being published by Sumero Books. And if you want to look on the Sumero Books site, you'll see that it's already listed in this catalog of books. We're not different from Siddhartha. And interestingly enough, when Sozri and I were going to that conference in Bodh Gaya, we had a very long 24-hour train ride from Delhi to Gaya. It was an overnight train ride. And unlike in Japan, where everything is so precise and so well organized and easy to make your way around in India, it's no holds barred. We went to the train station at 6 o'clock in the morning because the train was supposed to leave at 8. It was on the list of trains, but all of a sudden it went off the list of trains. And when we went up to find out what was going on, they said, well, it wasn't coming until 8 o'clock that night. And so we may as well go home and come back again. So we did that, only we came back again several hours early and went to the track it was supposed to be coming in on, and finally began to realize maybe we should check up on that one too. India is kind of all over the map. It is quite disorganized and quite the opposite of Japan. And so when we checked, we discovered it was not coming in on that track after all, despite the fact that it was listed as coming in on that track. And it was going to come in several hours later on a very different track. So we finally went over to the very different track and waited, and it was chaos getting in on the train. Everybody was scrambling in. There were conductors at each door trying to check off the list of names, but people were jumping ahead and climbing in. And in fact, we had to get a couple of unlisted guys off our bunk beds. We were in this big room full of bunk beds, which was an interesting overnight experience since everybody snored. And so it was this amazing symphony of different snores all night long. And in the morning we came, we woke up and we started thinking about when we were going to have to get off the train, and began to realize that there was no indication of what towns we were going through. The windows were so dirty that you couldn't see any signs, assuming there were any signs, and in many places there weren't. they were not announced, the stops were not announced, and in some cases they just slowed down and people had to jump off. So luckily, Sozui being German, her father had provided us with detailed maps of India. And when we crossed a very broad river, we used that as a landmark. That happened to be the Ganges, by the way, and sort of tried to calculate the towns as we were nearing Gaya, which is the closest town that has a train station to Bodh Gaya. And finally, we asked a man in our bunkhouse, I guess you would call it, our movie bunkhouse, if he could tell us when we were at passing through Gaya, because we needed to get off at Gaya. So he did tell us that it was coming up. We were in the last car in the train, so we went out to the back deck, so to speak. I don't know how recently any of you have been on a train, but the passenger trains of old, at least, had a sort of a back, a little back deck and a couple of stairs so you could hop down, because we weren't sure whether the train would actually stop and we might have to just jump off. And the man followed us out onto the this little deck, and he said, "Are you Buddhist?" And we said yes. Of course, we're dressed in robes, so it was fairly obvious, I guess. And then as we hopped off, he said, "My name is Siddhartha." And so it is apparently still a common name in India. So the Buddha had some experiences that made him think that there was something beyond the anxiety that seeing old age, sickness, and death had caused in him. And that's when he decided to go into spiritual practice. And initially he did what so many people do of one form or another. He chose a spiritual practice, the spiritual practice that was common in that day, and still is, by the way. And that was an ascetic practice. And many of us choose, for example, rather than ascetic practices, because I'm not sure there are too many of them in the Western world these days, to avoid encountering the concern directly by reading a lot or thinking a lot. And of course, that's something that we have to work with in our practice. That's one of the big challenges, actually, in our practice is how much we think. We're so accustomed to developing ideas, developing solutions, and there's a real role for that in life, but not in the Zendo. So I'd like to share with you this short piece by Mingyur Rinpoche. Mingyur Rinpoche, here is one book that I would suggest that you read, and that is In Love with the World. What is it? The Travels Through the Bardos of Living and Dying. A Monk's Travels through the Bardos of Living and Dying, and is by Mingyur Rinpoche. Tulku Mingyur Rinpoche. Tulku designates a person who is considered to be a reborn previous master. And it made an enormous difference in his life. When you read the books that he wrote before that, and then read this book, you will see that he gained a great deal of depth, or I would just say maybe it lost a lot of other extraneous stuff in the process of a 5-year pilgrimage, solar pilgrimage in India, including coming so close to death that he had a person-to-person, so to speak, encounter with extended process of dying. Somebody rescued him at the last moment and brought him to a hospital, which had to be paid for, by the way, in India. And the man actually paid for it so that he could get the treatment he needed, the antibiotics or whatever it was, and the nourishment and he was severely dehydrated, having had massive diarrhea and being eventually too weak to get to the water pump to even get himself any water. So that is a book that I would strongly suggest that you read. It's tremendously inspiring, and it gives an example, a living example of how to work with difficult stuff. He knew he was dying, just like Jacques Zen knew he was dying. And he worked with it in the same way that Jacques Zen did. Only in the case of Mingyur Rinpoche, who was the youngest son of another tulku and whose brothers were also tulkus, whose father, Urgyen Rinpoche, was extremely highly regarded as a very deeply awakened master in the Tibetan tradition. And so you can imagine that Mingyur Rinpoche was trained from a very early age. In fact, he was. His father was his first teacher. And by the time he was 12, he was going to his first 3-year, 3-month, 3-day retreat, intensive retreat, and typical in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So he had a lot of training under his belt, so that when he reached the point where he clearly could see that he was dying and he was too weak to do anything else, he examined it, he opened to it, he felt it. He remembers feeling sad that he wouldn't see his mother anymore, but otherwise he simply went into the experience of his body shutting down. And then he woke up in the hospital. It took him a little while to recover, but the man who had rescued him, to whom he had taught Zazen, by the way, had not only paid the hospital bill, but also had put some money in Mingyur Rinpoche's pack so that he was able to eat proper food in restaurants for a bit and take public transportation for a bit so that he wouldn't have to simply wander on his own steam. He had gotten sick because he was begging food at restaurants and had apparently gotten some tainted food. So here is what he says. True freedom of mind is something we can discover for ourselves through the practice of meditation. In Tibetan Buddhism, the most direct and powerful way to experience this inner freedom is by exploring the nature of awareness, a journey that puts us in touch with a source of equanimity, wisdom, and compassion that we can access anytime and anywhere. And this is what we can reach through the extended out-breath, along with when we're just out and about doing our work or moving around, buying food or whatever, and we have a moment we can just tune in to that sense of awareness, just settle into how it is actually feeling, what we are actually experiencing energetically, not in our head and not with stories. That doesn't work. That only creates more stories and puts up a barrier to awakening to that truth. But this is exactly how we can do it. Let me read this again. True freedom of mind is something we can discover for ourselves through the practice of meditation. In Tibetan Buddhism, the most direct and powerful way to experience this inner freedom is by exploring the nature of awareness, a journey that puts us in touch with a source of equanimity, wisdom, and compassion that we can access anytime and anywhere. And that inner sense of compassion, wisdom is built in. We can't not have it. Even people as seemingly evil as Hitler or Osama bin Laden have that built in, but it's so overlain with other stuff. And particularly in the case of Hitler, he was abused as a child, and that, I'm sure, caused him to have some ideas about other people, including a great deal of hatred. But to become increasingly aware. And the most amazing tool to do that with is extending the out-breath. But in order to have it work, we have to really extend it. This is not about multitasking as we breathe. This is about giving ourselves fully to the presence of the experience of extending the out-breath. When we extend the out-breath far enough, it drops off other concerns, other ways of paying attention, and narrows the focus to right here now, to the presence of that experience in the body, if we allow it to. But there is a learning curve on it. And anybody who's got a history of challenging life, it's going to be difficult to do. Just like the loving kindness meditation can be very difficult to do for people who have had such a challenging life. I know people that it has taken 2 years before they could actually do the breath the way it's meant to be done. But if we persist, it's amazing the results. It's a very grounding practice, for one thing, and it allows us to open to a deeper truth. And that is what our practice is about. If we want to become free, truly free, then awareness, attention, increasingly deepening presence is the only way to do it. We can't wave a magic wand and find a hole in our conditioning to sort of dive in. We have to erode it, melt it, so that we uncover this amazing beingness that we are. So give yourself fully in the Zendo to that extended out breath. If you're having to stand in line somewhere, if you're having to wait at a traffic light, or otherwise not have something else to do, do a single breath, fully extended. Give yourself completely to that breath. What can happen in one breath? Nothing terrible. And miracles can unfold through that practice. And the rest of the time, be as aware as possible in what you're doing. Yes, you can get lost in something really interesting, some really interesting work. But don't let that be an escape. The most important thing a human being can do in this precious life is to come to awakening, because that benefits not only each one of us, it benefits all beings, because there is no separation between us and everything else. So let me share this one more time because it is so important. True freedom of mind is something we can discover for ourselves through the practice of meditation. In Tibetan Buddhism, and also in Zen, the most direct and powerful way to experience this inner freedom is by exploring the nature of awareness. And that's what we are doing when we are extending the out-breath. We are exploring the nature of awareness. A journey that puts us in touch with a source of equanimity, wisdom, and compassion that we can access anytime and anywhere. And that source, as I said earlier, is not outside of ourselves. And if we're willing to persist, and there are obstacles, we can become truly, truly liberated. It's built in. It's just something that may take some time and a certain amount of effort. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.